Hi everyone, Samir and Sumit here, and welcome back to our F1 podcast.
Today we'll be talking about the 2023 Austrian Grand Prix.
And this was the return of the sprint weekend, so the second sprint that we've seen so far this season, and I think it was a really good race.
Yeah, I mean, two races now this weekend, and the
Yeah,
sprint was definitely, I think, one of the most exciting sprints we've had, and the
yeah.
whole weekend in general was just really action-packed.
Yeah, so moving on into FP1, the main thing that we got out of this session was that track limits were going to become a really big thing this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, especially on the final two corners, turns 9 and 10, we would see a lot of track
Yeah.
limits being violated there. The drivers were instructed to stay within that white line, but because those turns are so fast, it made it extremely hard for the drivers to stay inside.
Yeah, and also the cars this year are a lot heavier than they were the last couple of years too, so it just makes it even harder to slow the car down, especially with those really fast right-handers where you just kind of have to throw the car in and hope it sticks, and especially the cars that have very little downforce on their setups, it made it even more difficult to stay within the white lines.
But nevertheless, Max Verstappen once again looked well on the pace in his Red Bull.
Yeah,
He was absolutely flying. But close behind Ferrari were right there,
yeah.
second and third. And so it was a big step forward for Ferrari. And maybe we thought we could see someone challenging Verstappen and Red Bull
Yeah.
this weekend.
I mean, Ferrari did win here last year. It's been a circuit that they've been pretty strong at before, so it would be definitely be nice to see if they could challenge the two Red Bulls.
Yeah, but also speaking of Red Bull, it was an important weekend for Sergio Perez,
Yeah,
who failed to get into Q3 for the last three races, and so he was looking to bounce back. It was an important weekend, especially with all the talk around Daniel Ricciardo and
yeah,
possibly return to Red Bull. Sergio Perez would have to deliver this weekend for the Milton Keynes outfit.
yeah. We also saw early on in the session too. Lando Norris was struggling in his McLaren too. He was struggling to get a good lap in. He finished the session in P20 to P20, so that wouldn't have been helpful for him. I think he had some issues with his car at the beginning of the session, so he spent most of the time testing the new upgrade package that McLaren had brought to Austria. They brought it just for Lando Norris's car. And Silverstone next weekend is when Oscar Piastri would get the upgrades.
So in the end, it was Max Verstappen top of the timesheet, 2 tenths ahead of Carlos Sainz. Then came Leclerc third, and so both Ferrari second and third. Then
Yeah.
came Hamilton fourth, a pretty good result from him in the Mercedes, but albeit it was just one FP1 session, the only free practice session there would be. So all the drivers would have to there were different run plans throughout this session, and so it's not really representative of exactly what the cars are capable of.
Yeah.
And then Sergio Perez came fifth, and then Stroll sixth, then Kevin Magnussen seventh, Alonso down in eighth, and then Russell in ninth, and then Zhou Guanyu 10th in the Alfa Romeo.
Yeah, so now moving on to qualifying, and with this new sprint format, this qualifying on Friday would set the grid for Sunday's race. So it's not like the old format where this sets the grid for the sprint race. This sets the grid for the actual Grand Prix on Sunday. So
And
moving on into Q1 then, immediately we saw Valtteri Bottas lose his Alfa Romeo at turn 1 and spin, and that actually brought out the yellow flags. I think he brought out the red flags too because
it
he
did,
couldn't
yeah.
he couldn't get his car going again. It took he did eventually, but it took a really long time.
Yeah, I say he just couldn't get the car back out of neutral, so that's why they threw the red flag, and then immediately after the he got going again. So it was nevertheless it took a little bit longer, but he was
Yeah.
still able to get back in.
Yeah, and we saw the drivers at the end of Q1 trying to get their laps together. Alex Albon went from the drop zone into P8, so that was really good from him. And Nico Hulkenberg too in his Haas, he was able to get into Q2 as well. After going from the bottom 5 to P11, and Logan Sargent was actually up on Alex Albon, but then I guess he made a mistake at the final sector because that cost him time, and he set the exact time as Valtteri Bottas, but that Bottas set his time first, so that meant Sargent was behind him, and that was P16, so he would not make it through to Q2.
But then Valtteri Bottas ended up getting knocked out, and then Nick De Vries
Yeah.
also couldn't do anything in an important weekend for him as well.
Yeah.
De Vries couldn't do anything,
Yeah.
and so De Vries stayed the slowest out of the 20 drivers.
Yeah, so the bottom five that we lost in that session were Nick De Vries, Kevin Magnussen, Logan Sargent, Joe Guan Yu, and Yuki Tsunoda. Yuki Tsunoda, I was actually really surprised, even with Joe as well, that both of them got knocked out. They were pretty small margins, but I would have expected both of them to be in Q2.
So Bottas did make it out at the
Yeah.
expense of his teammate. So a disappointment for the Alfa Romeo on one side of the garage, delight on the other.
Yeah. So moving into Q2 then, at the very end of the session, we saw what the leaderboard looked like now. It was Verstappen ahead of Sainz. Norris was sitting in P3 ahead of Leclerc. So the McLaren of Norris with the new upgrades and just Lando Norris around Austria in general was just looking really quick again. And at the very second set of runs, George Russell, also the final set, Russell just could not seem to find a lap together, and at the very end he wasn't able to improve his time. Well, he did. He improved because of the final sector. He went up to P10, so he was still the driver at risk, and those behind were improving, like Sergio Perez as well. So Perez, he crossed the line and he went up to P2 momentarily, but then we saw these track limits come into play, and that meant Sergio Perez's lap time got deleted actually.
Cause he went over track limits at turn 9 and 10, and so that dropped him down, and so that would actually that would cause him to lose his lap and cause him to not make Q3 for a fourth consecutive race weekend, and so it was ever more disappointment for Sergio Perez.
Yeah, I mean, luckily this was the main Grand Prix too, so it's not like the sprint or anything. This is like for the main Grand Prix too, so he would have a big job on Sunday ahead of him.
Yeah, obviously a massive disappointment for Perez.
Yeah, so moving on into Q3 then. So the five we lost actually from Q2 were George Russell, Esteban Ocon, Oscar Piastri, Valtteri Bottas, and Sergio Perez. So, and Russell was also a big shock as well.
Because the Mercedes, I thought, had pace from FP1, but then they just didn't. Like, Russell could not get the lap together.
Yeah, so moving on into Q3 then, we saw Albon go to the top after he set the first time, but then Verstappen was just flying behind him, and he went quickest by over a second and 3/10. He went quicker than Albon. But Leclerc was also setting a really good sector, putting some good sectors together too. And as he crossed the line, he went up to P2 ahead of his teammate, Carlos Sainz, by 0.2 of a second.
Yeah, and Leclerc always, it seems like, goes good around Austria, winning last year.
Yeah.
And then having that challenge in 2019 with Verstappen.
Yeah.
So I expected Leclerc to be close, but I don't think I expected him to be this close.
Yeah. Just by 0.2 he was behind Max Verstappen. As Norris came across the line by 0.1, he was back on Carlos Sainz, so he slotted into P4. Gasly went up to P5 then, but then Alonso went up to P5. Even though he was 0.5 back on Lando Norris's time. So that was like a big gap between P4 and P5. And Nico Hulkenberg, he came across the line and he was in P9. So we could see that from 5th to 9th, they were separated by 0.4 of a second.
Yeah, so then going on to the final runs, Verstappen extended his advantage by only about 1/10 of a second, but the Ferraris were flying. Sainz was not far off him, exiting the second sector. He was just about 500s down, and then as he crossed the line, Sainz would not be able to snatch Verstappen's pole, but he went up to P2. But Leclerc was actually going faster than Verstappen, and so he went through the final couple of corners. He was absolutely throwing the Ferrari through the corners.
Yeah.
But just as he crossed the line, it wasn't enough to deny Verstappen pole at the Red Bull Ring by 500ths of a second. Leclerc could not get pole, but it did show that the Ferrari seemed to be able to challenge Verstappen at this track.
I mean, he was pushing that car through. Like, he was absolutely like on rails with that car. Yeah. He was trying to find I think he did extract everything out of that car. Yeah. Just wasn't enough.
Yeah, there was nothing more he could do. But nevertheless, it was Verstappen on pole with Leclerc P2, and then Sainz came third. Then Norris came fourth, and then it was Hamilton fifth in the Mercedes. So a pretty decent effort from
Yeah.
Hamilton. And then came the two Aston Martin, Stroll sixth ahead of Alonso seventh. Surprisingly, Stroll ahead of Alonso. And then Hulkenberg eighth in the Haas. Then Pierre Gasly ninth in the Alpine, and Alex Albon 10th.
Yeah, so now moving on into the sprint shootout. This is the qualifying to set the grid for the sprint race on Saturday. So moving on into SQ1, we saw Zhou Guanyu run very wide after losing the rear of his Alfa Romeo and having a spin at the penultimate corner. And Oscar Piastri too got caught up in some traffic as well, and he wasn't too happy about that. There was a Ferrari right in his way.
Yep, and we would see also traffic be a huge
Yeah,
factor in this race
yeah.
weekend.
Alex Albon once again too at the very end of SQ1 he was flying too, and he went up into P3 just a tenth off Lando Norris, who was in P1 surprisingly. Charles Leclerc then was next across the line, and he went up into P8 only. So for some reason Charles Leclerc was only in P8, but Verstappen was also because Verstappen was up 4 tenths of a second clear of George Russell, who was in P2, but Russell was on the medium tire.
Yeah, but then we saw Hulkenberg go P2, so
Yeah,
that got him out nicely. And then Sainz was absolutely flying, and as we saw Nick de Vries go up to fourth, and that pushed Logan Sargent out of SQ1.
yeah,
And then we saw Sainz go quickest after he was really pushing that Ferrari. And then next up across the line would come Zhou Guanyu as Alonso went up to fourth, and Zhou went up to 14th. So
yeah,
Oscar Piastri was at a really big risk because Stroll was improving, and Stroll was in the bottom five. And as Stroll exited the final corner, everyone waited to see, and Stroll did knock out Zhou Guanyu. So that was really big disappointment from Zhou Guanyu. But the biggest shock of all was Lewis Hamilton,
yeah.
who was 19th, and that was really a massive shock for Mercedes and for everyone.
Yeah, Lewis Hamilton was in 18th, and then also Oscar Piastri was out too of qualifying. So that was also another big shock considering where his teammate Lando Norris finished.
And Hamilton did run wide in the end, so one of his laps did get deleted, and he was only good enough for 18th. Really
Yeah.
big disappointment for Hamilton.
Yeah, so the five we lost from SQ1 were Zhou Guanyu by 1/1000th of a second he missed out, then Oscar Piastri, Lewis Hamilton, Valtteri Bottas, and Logan Sargent. So going into SQ2 then, towards the very end of the session, Charles Leclerc was finding time. He was in the drop zone surprisingly, 1/10 back on Alex Albon, who was the driver at risk, but he was finding time. And as he crossed the line, he went up into P4, so he was comfortably through. That pushed Albon out of qualifying, and Hulkenberg was now the driver at risk, as Verstappen went quickest ahead of Sainz. Stroll could not improve his time from P9, so that was a pretty dangerous spot for Aston Martin because drivers were improving, but they couldn't improve in time. Albon was out, Tsunoda was out, and Nick de Vries was also out.
Yeah, it was a really big shame. Albon had actually set the exact same time as Hulkenberg before the second runs, while Hulkenberg was able to just pull away.
Yeah.
But also, interestingly, before the final runs, we saw a scary incident in the pit lane, where as Hulkenberg was leaving the his pit box, the mechanic for the front left tire actually had the tire a bit too close to the car, and so that collided with the rear left tire that was on the car. And so we saw like Hulkenberg's car like almost like flip and then do like a 90-degree turn or something, and it was pretty scary. It looked like he was about to flip over, but luckily no one got hurt.
Yeah, so the five we lost from SQ2 were George Russell, who didn't set a time, Nick de Vries, Yuki Tsunoda, Pierre Gasly, and Alex Albon, who Albon just missed out by 6/100ths of a second. So showing that the Williams has a lot of pace, especially with the new upgrades that they brought at Canada. They seem to be working well here.
So going into SQ3 now in the battle for pole for the sprint, we saw Verstappen cross the line and he went fastest. But then Sergio Perez went up to P2, but he wasn't that far behind his teammate. He was only about 2-3 tenths behind his teammate.
Yeah.
And then we saw Lando Norris going really well around the track, as he always does at the Red Bull Ring. But interestingly too, we saw Sainz on the medium tire, which was pretty strange considering this was like the battle for pole.
Yeah. But I think Ferrari with that strategy, they expected to not be able to challenge for pole position, and they would rather save their soft tires for the Grand Prix.
Yeah.
So then we saw Lando Norris went up into P2. Science was just down in P4. Alonso improved up to P5, and then the drivers then finishing their laps. Stroll went up to P7 too, which knocked both the Hasses down to P9 and P10. And Max Verstappen was absolutely flying on his final lap, and by a tenth of a second he improved on his time to get pole position for the sprint. And then Perez, right at the final time of asking, he went up into P2 to make it a front row lockout for Red Bull.
Yeah, albeit though Verstappen was 5/10
Yeah.
ahead of Sergio Perez, so a really huge gap, and Leclerc couldn't manage to beat Sainz or Verstappen in this one. It was only P6 for him. So it was Verstappen on pole, and it was a Red Bull front row lockout with Perez second.
Yeah. And then it was Norris third, Hulkenberg fourth, Sainz fifth, Leclerc sixth, Alonso seventh, Stroll eighth, and then Ocon and Magnussen ninth and 10th. So now moving on to the F1 sprint, as we saw then, it was a wet start actually, it was wet weather.
Start.
So they were all on intermediate tires. So as the lights went out, we saw Sergio Perez get a really good start, and he was wheel to wheel with Verstappen, and he actually took the lead into turn 1 ahead of Max Verstappen. But then, because he went in so deep into turn 1, that compromised his exit. So Verstappen was already going wheel to wheel with him towards turn 3. But then Perez squeezed Verstappen onto the grass, so that heavily slowed Verstappen down. And this is then, as the run up towards turn 3, Verstappen absolutely sent it up the inside of Perez.
Yeah, Verstappen, we later found out, just had no control of the car when he braked, and so Perez got really upset about that. And I guess it was kind of a payback for Perez squeezing Verstappen onto the grass. But nevertheless, that compromised both of them. Perez had to go off the track, and then we thought Norris was going to take advantage of all that. But Norris actually got bogged down and had a bit of anti-stall, so he couldn't exit that corner quickly. He got sandwiched and behind both the Aston Martins. But Hulkenberg was able to take advantage of that and get really close to the Red Bulls on the run down to turn 4.
Yeah, Hulkenberg went up into P3, I think, fighting with Sergio Perez too. And the two Red Bulls were also squabbling for positions at turn 4 as well, that where Perez has been caught out multiple times before. But they seemed to go really wide. Verstappen just shoved Perez really wide, and that opened the door for Hulkenberg, who now went up the inside of Perez and then around the outside of Perez at turn 5, and he claimed the position for P2.
It was a really good move from Nico Hulkenberg, very opportunistic, and so we all were praying that Hulkenberg would be able to keep that and get some silverware.
Yeah, but I don't think that was going to happen, because a few laps later, then on lap 12, we saw Sergio Perez claiming getting right behind Nico Hulkenberg, and at the exit of turn 3, Hulkenberg just couldn't get the power down, and then Perez went around the outside of him at turn 4. So Hulkenberg was now down to 5th or to 3rd with Sainz right behind him in P4.
And Sainz was rapidly closing on the house, and so it would only be a matter of time before Hulkenberg would get overtaken by Sainz. But further back for 9th and 10th, not points in the sprint, we saw Leclerc and Norris having a really good battle through turn 5, 6, and 7.
Yeah. On lap 13, then we saw Carlos Sainz finally overtake the Haas of Nico Hulkenberg at turn 3. And then on lap 14, one lap later, we saw Charles Leclerc and Esteban Ocon have a really good fight, as Leclerc tried to go around the outside at turn 3, but then Ocon went down the inside again and claimed the position, and Leclerc tried to switch it back on the run down towards turn 5, but then Leclerc just Ocon had that inside line, so then he was able to keep his place ahead of Leclerc.
It was really frustrating for Leclerc, I bet, to be staying behind an Alpine when he tried to overtake them, and it also compromised him for Lando Norris. And we saw Leclerc succumb to that pressure when he went a bit wide at turn 10, and he actually went completely off the track, and so that allowed Norris to retake the 9th position and go ahead of Leclerc.
Yeah, and then moving on into lap 17 too, then we saw Lance Stroll making his way past one of the Hasses of Nico Hulkenberg for P4, and Alonso was right behind him. But on the run up towards turn 3, Stroll was able to brake that much later than Hulkenberg, and he took his place ahead of the Haas. And then on lap 18, then we saw Hulkenberg actually come into the pit lane to change tires, and I think he went onto the slick tires.
Yeah, so it was at this point, lap 18, where it was only 6 laps left, but it was that period of time where it was time
Yeah.
to switch over to the dry tires because that gave you more grip now, and the intermediates were just getting too hot. So a lot of the drivers started coming into the pits at that point, and we saw lap 19 that Russell would benefit from that, being one of the first to
Yeah.
pit. He was able to get past Lewis Hamilton.
Yeah, and then we saw Stroll. Stroll's engineer told him that people are putting slicks on, and I don't think Stroll wanted. He said it was too early, so he wasn't keen on coming in. But then on lap 20, we saw a really good battle between the Williams of Albon, the Ferrari of Leclerc, and the Mercedes of Hamilton at turn 3. Leclerc went around the outside of Hamilton, but then he just got compromised by that wet patch, and also Hamilton was on the soft compound of tires too, so he just got that better exit and was able to get past Leclerc again.
Yep, going on to lap 20, we saw an overtake on the main straight by Nico Hulkenberg,
Yeah.
who was able to get past Pierre Gasly and move up into 8th place, that final points place in
Yeah.
the sprint, of course. And then on lap 22, we saw George Russell on a charge. He also got past Pierre Gasly, and that would see Russell go up into
P9 it
P9,
was.
yeah.
And then on lap 24, the final lap, we saw a great fight between Lando Norris and Nico Hulkenberg as Hulkenberg went past Norris as Norris was still on the intermediate tires. So that wasn't that's why he was struggling so much. But and then Norris was also coming under pressure. Or Nico Hulkenberg was also putting immediate pressure on Esteban Ocon in 6th place because Ocon was also on the intermediate tires. So some drivers had different strategies. They were staying out, trying to keep track position and trying to keep the positions and sacrifice that extra bit of lap time because of being on the inter tires.
And we saw dividends being played out to George Russell again, who was able to get probably one of the easiest switchbacks of his life as he got past Lando Norris at turn 3, and that saw Russell go on a charge as he tried to get chase down Esteban Ocon, but
Yeah.
nothing would stop Max Verstappen from taking the sprint victory ahead by 20 seconds though of Sergio
Yeah.
Perez.
20
So
seconds.
that was a really big gap, but it was a Red Bull 1-2 in the sprint with Sainz third. So
Yeah.
a really good drive from Sainz.
And then we saw the Aston Martins fighting it out to the finish, and Stroll just stayed ahead of Fernando Alonso to claim P4 and beat Fernando Alonso. And on the very final lap, Hulkenberg took the fastest lap, and behind them we saw Ocon and Russell have a photo finish to the line. That reminded me of the Styrian Grand Prix we saw a couple of years ago in
Oh, yeah.
2020 with that like four-way photo finish. But Ocon just beat George Russell by 9/1000th of a second. And then Norris came home in 9th, and then Lewis Hamilton came home in 10th place.
So then we move on to the actual race now, this time the race on Sunday. And this was where the big
Yeah.
points were given out. This is what all the drivers were really focusing towards now.
Yeah, so at lights out, we saw a really good start from Max Verstappen. He was able to hold his lead as he moved across to cut off Charles Leclerc. But then we saw Leclerc trying to go to the outside to try to put pressure on Max Verstappen or switch back for the next corner. But Leclerc stayed behind Verstappen, and we could see Verstappen weaving to try to break the slipstream because Leclerc was putting a lot of pressure, and the amount of closing speed he had on the Red Bull was actually very surprising because at turn 3 he pulled alongside the Red Bull and went momentarily ahead, but then just due to the nature of Verstappen being on the inside line, he was able to keep his position. And then we saw at the run towards turn 3 again, Leclerc tried to go around the outside, while Verstappen just he had the inside line again and broke even later than Leclerc, and he kept his place.
Yeah, and then in the background there, turn 4, we also saw one of the Alpha Tauris go off. It was
Yeah.
Nick de Vries. I think it was Nick De Vries who just misjudged his braking zone
Yeah.
and just went straight on, and so not what De Vries needed at the start of this race.
Yeah, and lap 8:13, then we saw Nico Hulkenberg, after having a really good weekend so far, have to pull out and retire his Haas after an engine failure. So not at all what he needed. And that brought out the virtual safety car. And this is where we saw people like Hamilton, Norris, and Gasly all come in and rush into the pit lane to try to get more to get a free pit stop. Albon was also in, and so was George Russell. And the
Yeah.
Ferrari of Charles Leclerc, I think it was, also came in
Yeah,
on lap 16.
Yep, it was a double stack for Ferrari
Yeah.
as both of them came in, and same with Aston Martin. But going back to the De Vries crash, actually, it was because he got contact with
Yeah.
Valtteri Bottas at turn one, and so he lost a lot of his front wing, and then that's why he couldn't stop the car
Yeah.
at turn four. So that's why he went off, basically.
So yeah, on lap 17 now we saw the Ferrari of Carlos Sainz chasing down his old friend Lando Norris at turn 3. He went down the inside of Lando Norris as Lewis Hamilton was given a 5-second penalty for track limits. This race had a lot of track limit infringements. So Lewis Hamilton, this kind of became the story of his race so far, just him getting track limit penalties and then complaining about it the whole race.
Yeah. After the race, we found out the FIA released it was about 1,200 infractions and
1200, yeah.
drivers going wide and breaching the track limits. 1,200 is a lot.
Yeah, Albon was actually saying too in his post-race interview how the FIA, like, one thing they needed to improve on was getting that feedback quicker, because the engineers were telling the drivers, like, okay, you need to watch out for track limits, but then so they were being more cautious, but then they were finding out they were getting penalized, but that was like for something that happened 10 laps earlier. So it wasn't like fair to them because they were staying within the lines, but they just weren't told early enough.
Yeah. So going on to lap 19 now, we saw Carlos Sainz finally get past Lewis Hamilton, and then lap 20, Sainz was on a charge and he got past Sergio Perez in the Red Bull around the outside at turn 4, and it was a really good move from Sainz, albeit he was on the fresher tire.
Yeah, we also saw race control note the incident between Logan Sargent and Pierre Gasly in the pit lane, I think it was, after an unsafe release between both of them.
Yeah, Gasly came out and Sargent had to slam on the brakes so that he could enter his pit box. But at the same time, then on lap 21, we saw a really good battle between Russell and Tsunoda into turn 4, and then 4 cars separated: Albon, Magnussen, Ocon, and Stroll, all of them jockeying for position, as we saw Magnussen and Ocon going wheel to wheel, and Ocon was able to go around the outside and chase after Albon, and then Stroll was caught behind Magnussen.
So moving on to lap 25, then Max Verstappen finally came in for his pit stop, and he went on from the medium tires to the hard compounder tires to go to the very end. And Leclerc took the lead then, and Verstappen's run of leading every lap since he took the lead in Miami came to an end as Leclerc took the lead of the race. And it was a very tight exit between Sainz and Verstappen, and Sainz actually came out ahead of Verstappen.
Yeah, but then on lap 26, Sainz broke later into turn 3, but Verstappen was able to get the switchback, and with DRS, Verstappen got past Sainz before they even hit turn 4.
And moving on to lap 28, then Lando Norris and Lewis Hamilton were having a good battle as Norris had DRS and he was trying to get ahead of Lewis Hamilton, and towards turn 4 he was able to get ahead before they even reached the braking zone because of the DRS.
Yep, and then it was just we saw earlier on that same lap, we saw Sainz go a bit wide, and it was another track limit violation for in this race, and it was at the expense of Carlos Sainz.
I think he earned a penalty because of that,
Yeah,
to a
he
5-second
did.
penalty.
Yep.
Then on lap 30, we saw Sergio Perez make his way through the field from the back of the grid. He made his way past George Russell and up into P8. And on lap 35, we saw now Verstappen was right behind Charles Leclerc too. And with DRS, he towards turn 3, he was able to get past the Ferrari and up back into P1 again.
Yeah, it was like this time it was the roles reversed, like 2022.
Yeah.
Charles Leclerc was the one overtaking Verstappen all the time. this time Verstappen was the one that was just completely much faster than Leclerc, and so
Yeah.
despite everything Leclerc tried to do, he could not keep up with the Red Bull.
Yeah, then moving on to a lap later, then we saw the Red Bull of Sergio Perez making his way past Pierre Gasly. I think that was earlier in that lap. He was able to move up into P7.
And we saw one of the Haas's, it was Kevin Magnussen, get really close with I think
Yeah.
Nick De Vries, and
He was
De Vries,
forced wide into the gravel at the exit of turn 5.
yeah, and it was pretty dangerous from De Vries, but
Yeah.
luckily both of them were able to continue going.
Yeah, and lap 42, then Sergio Perez was chasing after Fernando Alonso, and into turn 3, he was able to get past Fernando Alonso. The Aston Martins too just seemed to be pretty off this weekend in general.
Yeah, they
Just
didn't
didn't have the pace that we've seen from them normally.
they didn't look that competitive. It was like one of those races again, like same like Spain, where Alonso normally who looked competitive before, Alonso was definitely not in contention for the podium places at
Yeah.
this race.
Yeah. So moving on to lap 47, then we saw Lando Norris and Carlos Sainz have a really good battle, as in towards turn 4, Sainz went around the outside of Norris, and that turned into the inside line for turn 5, and he was able to move up into P4 past Lando Norris. And on lap 56, then Sergio Perez was now right behind Lando Norris as well, and towards turn 4, he went down the inside and claimed the position.
Also, while this was all happening, I just want to talk about the Williams
Yeah.
were showing really good pace. Albon was running in the points on lap 56 with Sargent in 13th, not
Yeah.
that far behind. Well, actually, yeah, he was kind of like 13 seconds behind. But
Yeah.
Sargent's pace was still really good, and he was on
Yeah.
course for a pretty high finish when he needed one.
Yeah. On lap 59, then this is where we saw a really good battle between Sergio Perez and Carlos Sainz. Perez, he was towards turn 3. He actually got ahead of Sainz before the DRS detection point. So even though he made a switchback at turn 3, Sainz had the DRS, so he was able to fight back, and he went around the outside at turn 4 and was able to move back up into P3. And Perez again tried to switch it back there, but Sainz just had the inside line, and he was able to stay ahead.
Yeah, they almost touched on the way. They might have
Yeah.
touched on the way to turn 3, but Sainz was having none of Perez's attacking. And we would think that Perez would have learned to stay behind Sainz, but on lap 61 he did the same thing
Yeah.
again, where he got ahead at the DRS detection point, and Sainz was able to stay ahead. But actually on lap 61 Perez did have DRS,
Yeah.
and so there was nothing Sainz could do to defend. And so Perez just went the long way around the outside at turn 4
Yeah.
and got back into the podium places.
Yeah, on the very last lap too, we saw Max Verstappen come in to pit for the soft compound of
On the
tires,
second to last
and
lap.
that was a statement right there, showing that even though he was leading the championship by a huge amount right now, he's still willing to do anything for that 1 point, and that also shows how much he trusts his team too.
Yep, it was more than just that one lap.
Yeah.
It had confidence. He had confidence in his team. The whole team had confidence of themselves, and so they pitted on the second to last lap.
Yeah.
And we could actually see Verstappen weaving around to get tire temperature, while Leclerc was just 3 seconds back. So it just shows how dominant they were.
Yeah, so on the very final lap, then Max Verstappen, he crossed the line to win the Austrian Grand Prix for the 5th time at the Red Bull Ring, and he claimed the fastest lap too on the final lap. Charles Leclerc came home for 2nd place to take another podium in Austria, and Sergio Perez came home from P15 to take a much-needed podium finish for him. Then at the very end, then we saw the finishing order was Sainz from Norris, Alonso, Hamilton, Russell, Gasly, and then Stroll the top 10. But that was during the race. After the race, Aston Martin actually launched a protest to see if all the track limit violations, because they felt that a lot of drivers violated the track limits. So that changed up the order after 8 drivers got penalties. So the new top 10 was Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc, Sergio Perez. The podium remained unchanged. Then Lando Norris 4th, Alonso 5th. Sainz had been dropped down to P6. Russell was moved ahead of his teammate Lewis Hamilton in 7th. Hamilton 8th. Stroll moved up to 9th, and then Pierre Gasly moved up into the points.
So basically, Pierre Gasly, Alex Albon, Logan Sargent, Kevin Magnussen, Carlos Sainz and Lewis Hamilton all got 5 second penalties and
Yeah.
in the race. But then after the race, Sainz, Hamilton, Gasly, Albon, and Sargent received additional 10-second time penalties.
Yeah.
And then Esteban Ocon was given a 30-second. He was
Yeah.
giving 30 seconds worth of penalties, and so that was actually he broke the
Yeah.
record for the most penalties given in a race. I mean, that's not a record you want to be given.
Yeah.
And Nick De Vries got a 15-second penalty, and then Yuki Tsunoda got another 5-second penalty. So not good for AlphaTauri, but it was just so many penalties coming in after the race. The
Yeah.
FIA need to figure out what to do with that.
Yeah. Well, that was it for Max Verstappen winning the Austrian Grand Prix again. And thank you guys for listening to this episode of our podcast. And be sure to join us next time when we take a look at the 2023 British Grand Prix. Thank you.